I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. I'm recording today amidst winds of change. Usually I give you just a little vase of flowers. Today I'm giving you a whole garden, which I'm only willing to show because of Oscar, my landscaper for life, who says that he watches these videos. So now we'll see if he's telling the truth. My topic today is, when did you stop being wrong? And this started from a Substack chat with viewer Jack Sirius. And we were talking about how disconcerting it is to be finding out that narratives that you have believed all your life are possibly not what they're made out to be. Not necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater, but that there is not truth to the whole narrative. And that includes the Holocaust story. It includes environmentalism, which for him is pretty much the issue that he's spent his life around. And so in all of these different areas, it's required kind of a, he describes it as being one of those nuts and bolts sculptures that somehow looks like a rooster, but is made up of all these jumbled parts. So I wanted to make some sense out of what is it that we should be holding on to and what should we be willing to change. And that to change is to grow, is to learn. You never learn anything unless you're willing to be wrong. And so the more that you've been wrong, the more that you've learned, and the closer you are to understanding how things really are. So let's look at this. What's the first step in the art of being wrong? The first step is to figure out where you're not willing to change your mind. So I call that my dogma. My dogma is only one: that I am no better than anyone else. I refuse to believe in my own superiority. And what that does is give me a yardstick. It gives me one thing that's fixed that I can measure other things that I find out about through. It gives me a logic. And so when I hear a narrative that says, oh, they hate us because we love freedom, or Germans are just born people who are greedy and vicious and ruthless, I know that that's not the truth. I'm not willing to accept that. And so that is the one fixed thing. It's like having a yardstick that then you can measure everything else by. So there are people who I admire, but where the forms of the truth differ. So for instance, Matt Ehret and his wife, Cynthia Chung, I agree with them on many things, but there are a few places where the form differs. And that's not unimportant, because I think there are 3 times, for instance, that we have almost taken back community sovereignty in the history of humanity as we know it, and that we were tricked into giving that up again. One time is in ancient Greece with democracy versus anarchy, and I talk about that in my Debunking Democracy episode. Another time, I think, was 2,000 years ago with Jesus versus the Christ, and the Christ being an inclusive all of us rather than one particular person. And I talk about that in other episodes. And then within 250 years ago, I would say Franklin versus Hamilton, or we can look at that as Confederacy versus a centralized federal government, which might be called Fedarchy. But the reason that these aren't important is because we agree on the content. When I hear Matt and Cynthia talking about why the Great Reset is so diabolical because of the creativity and the beauty of all people that needs to be expressed, that deserves to come out, I know that we're in full agreement on the important thing. And so whether the forms need to come to an agreement or not, if I'm wrong, if they're wrong, it doesn't matter. It'll happen if it needs to happen, because what we agree on is that important concept that we are all having this spark, this creativity that deserves to come out. Now let's look at an example where the form is in agreement, but the content differs. My very smart viewer from New Zealand, Colin Maxwell, sent me an interview with some caveats that he was not necessarily a fan of these people, but wanted to know my thoughts. So this is Greg Hunter interviewing Ed Dowd. And he starts out the preface by saying that Ed is someone who made billions for BlackRock by knowing what were good businesses producing good products. Let's start with the level of delusion there. And then it goes on to where Ed talks about how the vaccine has been the greatest fraud and the deadliest fraud in history, that he knows data and he's looked at the data and clearly it doesn't match what they said about it being safe. And he talks about how excess mortality has gone up by 20%, and that all of these things add up to the fact that people are still coming down with repercussions from these vaccines, and that when it becomes clear, there is going to be riots in the street and heads are going to roll, and we had better figure out how to protect ourselves. And so Greg's question to that was, so with mortality rates up and children dying, should we buy gold or should we short Pfizer? That is a completely different content from what I and others are looking at. And when Ed talks about this and talks about him as just being able to see the data, he clearly hasn't read Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book, where he tells exactly how this has been going on for the last 50 years. So he wouldn't need to be some genius to be able to know that that data is wrong. And then he says that he thinks that we need to take control of this before someone else spins it and uses it for their own purposes into something like the Great Reset. That, to me, is backwards. That's saying, oh, Pfizer did this just out of sloppy research and a push to make short-term profits, but it had nothing to do with the Great Reset unless they decide to use it, rather than flipping that and saying, this is the agenda of the Great Reset all along, and they know exactly what's going to happen with the population when things come to light. And so if there are going to be riots on the street, which he says, oh, I wouldn't do that, of course, and Greg, you wouldn't do that, but there's people out there and, they've already looted and killed and created havoc from much lesser things. I'm not sure whether he's talking about Black Lives Matter and being racist, or talking about Antifa and being classist. So one or the other, I don't know. So either way, he sees this as happening, but he sees himself as being superior to that. Well, yes, Ed, if you're setting up your hedge fund to be able to figure out how to take advantage of this, I guess you are protected. And on the complete other side of that, in getting the form right, understanding the data, but also getting the message right of what it is that we need to learn from this, along with Robert F. Kennedy, who I adore, is Robert Malone. He sends out his Substack on Fridays and Sundays with cartoons and animations. And this time he has 3 different clips from John Prine. And he ends it with, John reminded us all to take care of each other, that we are not economic units, but luminous beings, and that humanity is much more important than wealth. that we are all fragile and need each other. Have a great Sunday, and please take a moment to remember those who are gone, whose presence graced us with so much wisdom. Our lives are short, and we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And someone who is a master at being wrong, in other words, a master of continuing to learn his whole life, was Ben Franklin. In my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, I quote his speech that he gave at the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention. I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall ever approve them. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right but found to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its fault, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to its people if well administered, and I believe further that it is likely to be well administered for a course of years, and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I doubt, too, whether any convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interest, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected. The opinions I have had of its errors I sacrifice to the public good. I have never whispered a syllable of them abroad. Within these walls they were born, and here they shall die. In my willingness to doubt everything except that I am not superior to anyone else, I've come to some suspicions, some hypotheses that, as far as I can tell, no one else is taking seriously. On the spiritual side, I've talked about this theodicy triangle, the idea that a world of pain and suffering is God's will, versus there is no God, to what I entertain, which is that if we are really one mind, the entire world could be not real, could be existing in our mind as our collective delusion. And the primary obstacle to thinking that is when I don't want to see myself as potentially being you, it's because I want to see myself as better than you. So letting go of that idea allows us to entertain that hypothesis. And I think it's related to the fact that I seem to be the only one I know taking seriously that we can change the system and create an entire economic system of local community sovereignty. I think that understanding that things that seem too big to change can be changed as easily as changing our mind is something that we should be considering, because changing our mind is harder than you think. So to be right is to be righteous. It's to be fixed. It's to stop learning. And to be wrong, not just to be willing to be wrong, not just be willing to admit that you're wrong, but to welcome being wrong, to seek out being wrong, to celebrate every time you're wrong. That is a way of welcoming reality, of saying that it's more important to understand than it is to be right. And I hope that we come to that not just because it's kind of lonely being in this space where I'm the only one entertaining these possibilities, but also because I think being wrong is catching, and I'm hoping that that's the virus that we can spread next. So while I have you in this vulnerable, open-minded mindset, let me show you some of my craziest videos. This one on Kali and ultimate reality, which was one of my first, and this one that presents the hypothesis that we collectively are the womb of God. Thank you, and thank you for subscribing and for being part of my community on YouTube and Substack.